Welcome in, everybody. It's your boy, Scott Proctor, and we're here with the third college football primer with the great Brad Edwards. Brad, thanks so much for joining us again this week, my man. Let's get into it, man, with bowl season rapidly approaching. Let's start here, though, with the transfer portal. So just last Monday alone, 667 players entered the transfer portal, breaking a previous all-time daily record of 270. It's bananas right now in the transfer portal, as you know, Brett. So let's talk a little bit about that. How will this ever-changing transfer portal situation, you think, kind of mostly change how we see and view college football moving forward here?
Yeah, I think my kids are in the transfer portal. Everybody's in the transfer portal right now. It's nuts. And as we speak, I think we're somewhere close to 1,500 total players since the portal opened on December 5th. And I think it's getting close to 1,000 FBS players. So you're talking about some significant turnover. And by the way, this period lasts until January 18 that players are allowed to enter the portal. And then there's a second period after spring ball is over in May where they can do it again. My guess is when all is said and done, the average FBS team will have lost 8 to 10 players to the transfer portal, which is insane when you think about losing that many players. And, and what you're able to replace them with is really going to determine, what kind of season you're able to have the following year. So much of this is no longer about like building for the long-term future. It's about building for the immediate future. And so you have, coaches who come in who are relatively new at a program, will see immediate needs, and they'll go ahead and start filling them with players. And it's like, hey, well, just win now and we'll worry about tomorrow. And, whether that means you have to keep hitting the portal hard every year in order to keep up, who knows? But at a certain point, you would think for long-term success, you would need a good foundation of high school players. But that's really not the direction a lot of teams are going. And unfortunately, the trickle-down effect, as we look at signing day next week, and a whole lot of schools right now are dedicating places in their signing classes for these transfers, there are fewer players that are signing with FBS schools out of high school, a lot fewer than, what we will have seen in previous years. And, once you take it all the way down to the FCS level, D2, D3, coming out of high school, there are going to be fewer scholarships offered to players than there previously were. And that's one of the unintended consequences of this portal. There's a lot of good that comes from it, especially for the players. But that's one thing where it's not helping players is the guys who are transitioning from high school to college are not going to have as many opportunities as they used to.
No doubt about it. I want to talk about what you think this means for parity in college football, because obviously that's a buzzword that ideally that's what we would all want college football to have a lot of, and that's parity. And we don't always see that. But what do you think this, growing transfer portal situation would do in terms of parity? You think the rich will continue to get richer? You think there will be a more even distribution of talent, among schools? How do you kind of view that?
Yeah, I think it helps a number of different types of programs. It can also hurt you, obviously, if you lose some really good players and you can't find players of equal talent to replace them. Right. I think where it can really help is if you're able to bring in experienced guys. I mean, let's say you're a Power 5 program and you're kind of mid-tier in your conference. Even if you're getting guys from Group of 5 conferences, theoretically, players who were more lightly recruited coming out of high school. But once they've developed and they've played a couple of years and you can identify, okay, who can play and who can't, you probably have greater certainty of what you're going to get with that 2-year guy who has some college games under his belt than you do out of a 4-star coming out of high school. Because to be quite honest, if you pay attention to recruiting, a lot of these guys don't end up being as good as everyone expects them to be coming in. Yeah. And so I think the mid-tier programs that can get a lot of quality transfers, I'm not saying that they're going to contend for the playoff, but they can go from, say, 4-8 to 8-4 very easily. And then in the case of a program like USC, where you've already got a good amount of talent and you just have some glaring holes, you can get a few players in those spots and maybe make a run at the playoff. But to your question, I think ultimately it's really helping more than anyone the rich, because you look at programs like a Georgia who I don't think they brought anyone in out of the portal last year. I don't know what they'll do this year. But look at Alabama, Ohio State, the programs that recruit at the very highest level. Inevitably, after a season, they're going to look at their two deep and they're going to say, okay, here are, 2, 3, 4 positions where we really could use an upgrade. Previously, you just had to deal with it. You just had to find a way to cover it up.
Yeah.
Now you can go out and you can target, some guy who's been a couple years starter or maybe an all-conference player, somewhere else in your league or another Power 5 league at a program that had no chance of really contending for a title. And you could say, hey, come here and you got a chance to play for a championship. And so that's why I think that ultimately these top 5 teams, the ones that we're used to seeing in the playoff year after year, they're going to be able to plug the few holes they actually have on their roster every year because of the transfer portal. And so I can't but see how that benefits them.
No doubt about it. Brad, I saw something else here recently, too, that I wanted to get your thoughts on. I saw this statistic that nearly 10% of all players in the portal for college football are quarterbacks. So I'm curious if you think that's kind of a trickle-down effect maybe of the NFL, because as we know, that's a league where it's kind of have or have nots, especially at the quarterback position. Your franchises, your team success, a lot of the times is dependent on how good your quarterback is. Are you seeing that kind of bleed into the college football landscape, especially after us seeing Caleb Williams, who was in the transfer portal last season, now win the Heisman this year?
I mean, sure, after you see a guy transfer and then immediately win the Heisman, it's going to get your attention. But at the same time, this has been going on for years with quarterbacks transferring. Now, to have a guy who was going to be the starter at a maybe top 10 program like Oklahoma transfer out and go to a different place. Now, it was a little bit unique in that he was following his departed head coach. That's not going to happen every day. That part was unusual, but just the idea of a quarterback transferring out, looking for greener pastures, that happens all the time because quarterback is, maybe the only position on the field. You could argue offensive line as well, where the backup generally doesn't play meaningful snaps.
Right.
And so you're either the starter or you don't really play when the game's on the line. That's always been the case with quarterback, or I should say, at most schools, that's the case with quarterback. And so we've seen for a decade or more, some of these highly recruited kids coming out of high school that when their freshman season ends and they don't believe they're going to be the starter their second year, they're hitting the road. And so it's not only those guys now, but you do have, some of these other guys, who are maybe a starter at a place where they're not surrounded by as much talent. Maybe the offensive line isn't giving them enough pass protection. Maybe their receivers aren't talented enough to make them look as good as they think that they're capable of looking. You could see someone who's a starter, firmly entrenched as a starter, going to a program or looking for a program with more talent and making a move that way. And I think that's the key is looking for. Okay, a lot of these kids, there's a belief that they're going to find greener pastures if they just go out and look for them. But unfortunately, for a lot of them, they're not going to find a better situation. And we're not going to hear many of those stories. We're going to hear the Caleb Williams situations glorified, and we're going to hear those talked up every Saturday next fall when you got a guy who's just transferred in who's having a big season. But for every one of those guys, there might be 2 guys who left a decent spot, if not a good spot, at a school and went to what they thought was going to be a better spot, ended up not being better. And it ends up not helping their football career, and even worse, might even derail their academic career as well.
Right, no doubt about it. I mean, you're absolutely right. Like as the saying goes, it's not always greener on the other side. And Chris Hummer at 24/7 Sports, he had this, and I wanted to bring it up too. They did a study after the 2019-20 cycle that showed 47% of FBS players on scholarships at Power 5 schools who entered the portal either ended up dropping down to FCS, not getting signed, or going the junior college route. So a lot of these times, as you just said, these guys don't end up in better places a lot of times. We'll hear about the Caleb Williams, but again, it's not always green on the other side. I hope that, a lot of these athletes take heed of that.
Yeah, and look, a lot of them, unfortunately, and it's the case for most of us in life, sometimes we just have to learn the hard way. But you do hope that they would learn from the experiences of other players, and that as more data is available, the more years we get into this situation, that we'll start to, see coaches be able to present that to players and show them that maybe the odds aren't as heavily in their favor if they transfer as they might think.
No doubt about it. No doubt about it. Let's move on, though, because, again, I said at the top, it is bowl season, and we're still a little bit of ways away from the college football playoff and the New Year's Six bowls, but there's still plenty of action kicking off before Christmas. So let's talk about one matchup, Brad, that you're looking at, you're excited about pre-Christmas that you'll have on the TV.
Yeah, there are a few that jumped out at me. I like Louisville, Cincinnati. Sounds good on paper to me. I remember some great matchups those teams had in Conference USA. I also think Washington State, Fresno State will be a fun game. But the one I'm most looking forward to is Air Force against Baylor. And the reason I'm partial to this one, not only do I remember a lot of these, even when I was a kid watching bowl games where someone would play, say, Air Force in a bowl, and like they'd get up against an Ohio State and just drive them crazy. Right. But in this particular case, going against a team from the Big 12 that has spent all season facing mostly wide open offenses, for them to now have to face that Air Force attack. Now, granted, they got a few weeks to get ready. Actually, fewer weeks considering it's a pre-Christmas bowl, though. Right. And this is, this is quite an adjustment. Now, I mean, for Baylor, we'll see how they're able to handle it. But these are. It's always fun when you get a non-Power 5 going against a Power 5. But a situation like this, where now you have an offense that they have never seen the likes of before, it for a fun game, because you would figure Baylor's going to have its own success being able to move the ball and score. But can Air Force take the air out of the ball, and how good of a job will Baylor do being able to slow down that offense? Yeah, no doubt about it. I mean, I think that's an underrated piece of football that people maybe don't think about a lot of times, when you have to game plan defensively for an offense that you don't see all the time, or really ever. In the case of, Baylor going against Air Force and, their old school type of offense. So that's going to be something to watch for sure. One matchup I'm looking at is Florida and Oregon State. Obviously has the bigger names. Oregon State obviously had a strong, really strong finish to the season that ended up with a Pac-12 title win over Oregon. And then obviously there's Florida, who's going to be without quarterback Anthony Richardson, who's going to be entering the draft. But Jack Miller is an interesting story. Obviously, talking about the transfer portal, he's a transfer from Ohio State who had high expectations coming into college. So he's getting his first collegiate start in a bowl game against, again, another strong Oregon State squad. So I'm excited about that one for sure, Brad. I think that one that's going to be one to watch. Well, and I think what you mentioned is something to really keep an eye on for all of the bowl season, which is guys who are going to get an opportunity to play because of players who either have decided to sit out the bowl game because they have the draft coming up and they don't want to get injured, or there were starters that left to hit the transfer portal. And so I think with some of these teams, and even more of them probably when we get closer to New Year's Day, are going to have some guys out there, maybe even starting, who hardly played during the season. So, right. And I mean, for some of these teams, it's going to feel a little bit like an NFL preseason game. Yep. As far as there are going to be guys out there that maybe you're not expecting to see. But look, it's also like an NFL preseason game in that this is an opportunity for them to prove themselves. And some of those guys might come out and play well. And then sure enough, when they take the field, next September, those guys are back in the starting lineup because they got a chance to really, do it in live action against good competition, and they prove that they belong. Absolutely. It's going to be fun to watch on a lot of different fronts as bowl season kicks off and gets rolling. Probably last question I got for you, Brad, before we get up out of here for this third edition of the College Football Primer. We've seen a lot of players in new places, but we're also seeing a lot of head coaches in new places. So I got 5 names for you, 5 head coaches who are in new spots. Start here with Matt Rule in Nebraska, obviously. Kenny Dillingham to Arizona State. Luke Fickell to Wisconsin. Hugh Freeze to Auburn. And obviously the big one, Deion Sanders primetime to Colorado. Which of those 5 head coaches in the new spot do you think is set up the most to succeed? To succeed in year 1 or overall? That's a good question. That's an important distinction, Brad. That's a very important distinction. I would say long term, because I would assume none of these 5 coaches are on a 1 or 2 year plan. I would say long term. I tend to gravitate toward Rule and Fickle both, because I always feel like the Big Ten West is wide open.
Right.
Because nobody in that division recruits at a really high level. I think you've got a bunch of teams that are all pretty similar to each other in talent.
Right.
And so if you can get the right guys in from the transfer portal, especially if you can get the quarterback in that division, not a lot of high flying offenses, on there. I mean, that's probably why Purdue came out on top this year. But I think there's opportunity there for both of those guys. I mean, right now I would favor Fickle, even just because Wisconsin, is more established. But I mean, Matt Rule, he has certainly shown that he can take a program and build it up another notch or two from where it was relatively quickly. And so I really like both of those guys, and I like them because they're in the same division and they're going against the same teams.
No doubt about it. Yeah, all those other guys, they're going to have challenges. We talked about Hugh Freeze challenges in Auburn and the SEC, and Kenny Dillingham's going to have a job on his hands at Arizona State, and obviously Prime has a lot to do, in Colorado to get the Buffs back to relevancy. But this has been awesome, Brad. Thanks again so much for your time, my man, for this third edition of the College Football Primer. We'll catch you next week. And before we do that, though, make sure you drop a like, make sure you comment and subscribe to catch me and Brad talking college football every single week. But for your boy, Scott Proctor and Brad Edwards, we'll see you next week.
Thanks for watching. Feel free to check out our other videos, and don't forget to smack that subscribe button down below while you're at it. Also, for more great and original content, head right over to bvmsports.com.